And anyway, it's time to move on to the next presentation, and I would like to welcome our next speaker, who is Xin Xin Yan.
Yes,
Hello.
I am. Hi. Hi, everyone.
Yes, and you're going to talk about similes.
Yes, I am.
And all right, so the floor is yours.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, sure. I'll just make it bigger and play. Right, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Xin Xin Yan. I'm a linguistic PhD student at UCL. So before I say anything relevant, I just want to thank the organizer for not putting my talk under the session of metaphor. Apparently, I think we shared similar thoughts on metaphor and simile, they being distinct figures. So I really appreciate that. So today I want to share with you some parts of my research on simile interpretation. Basically, how do we understand similes? For example, John is like a rolling stone. Is there any difference between understanding a simile versus understanding a literal comparison? So, for example, John is like his father. Well, in order to do so, perhaps we couldn't avoid trying to consider the first issue, which is what are similes? Although we do have a commonly shared notion of similes being referred to figurative comparisons, but figurativeness itself in comparison statements is much harder to be detected compared with in a categorical statement. So usually for metaphor, figurativeness means apparent falsity and absurdity of the literal meaning. So apparently it is clear that John is a cactus is literally false because the human cannot be a plant. So for an axis Y form, usually for a metaphor, it involves category mistakes. And even without any context, we have no problem to say that John is a cactus is a metaphor, simply because the literal meaning is false, and the only way to try to make sense of the expression is to derive a non-literal interpretation. But this is not the case for simile, because for any comparison statement, whether it is literally or not, the linguistic meaning is always semantically true, as everything is like everything else in some or other respect. So we cannot use literal falsity anymore to set apart figurative comparison with literal comparison. So for John is like a cactus, their linguistic meaning is semantically true. Then I'd like to add another few things, which is literal falsity is not even 100% reliable to identify a metaphor. So we can have a categorical statement which is semantically true, but is intended figuratively. For example, no man is an island. So their literal meaning is true, but it's trivial. So that's why we need to derive something beyond the literal interpretation. And so similes are just like those metaphors. So they are comparison statements that are intended to be understood figuratively. Now, what does that mean? So for this comparison, so for John is like a comparison when it is intended figuratively, and that means the resemblance between John and cactus is not in any sense literal. So John does not have extra spikes, but he is only mentally thorny and prickly. But the same comparison, actually, it can also be intended quite literally when a speaker wants to convey an exact literal resemblance between John and cactus. For example, there can be many possibilities, but I just choosing one of them, which is John is like a cactus in the respect that he can survive with only little amounts of water. So the same comparison, it can actually be intended either figuratively or quite literally. I think we are now ready to have a comparison version of the literal loose metaphorical continuum. So in their deflationary accounts of metaphors, Bubba and Wilson, they have proposed this literal loose metaphorical continuum. So they suggest that there is a continuum cases between literal categorical statements and more creative and figurative uses of categorical statements. So as there is literal loose and metaphorical categorization, we can also have a literal loose and metaphorical comparison. Then for literal comparisons, they are the comparison statements that are intended literally. So for example, baseball is like cricket, John walks like a penguin, and his face is right like a beet. And for those comparisons, the relevant properties associated with the vehicle are literally predicted, and they are intended to be true of the topic as well. But actually, there are many comparisons that we use in our life are intended loosely. So for example, our trip to London was like an adventure film. And usually the speaker, so one of the very likely implicator of that comparison is our trip to London is very exciting. It is more dangerous and dramatic than expected. So usually the speaker does not commit to a literal resemblance between the trip and the adventure film. So it's usually not as thrilling and as dramatic as the fictional film, but they are close enough for an effective communication. So in those cases, relevant properties associated with an adventure film, they are moderately or in a quantitative manner adjusted in order to warrant the right set of implicators to be derived. And for simile, we can also have comparisons that are intended to be understood metaphorically. So for example, his life was like a skiff with no oar, and John is like a cactus when we try to say John is unfriendly and thorny and prickly. Well, for those cases, the relevant property, well, some of the relevant properties associated with the vehicle concept, they are not literally predicted of the topic. So for saying his life was like a skiff with no oar, I'm not suggesting that his life was anything that floats on the river or was anything that can be proper forward. So although those properties, they are very important and they are highly salient and closely related with the vehicle concept, a skiff with no oar, however, they are not literally applicable to describe someone's life. And in order to make sense of the expression, the concept, so those properties need to be undergo radical conceptual modulation in order for them to be literally compatible to describe someone's life. Then I think now we're ready to answer the first question, what are similes? So similes are metaphorical comparisons. So they are comparisons that are intended metaphorically, and this should be the only criterion when it comes to judge whether a comparison is a simile or not. And from here, I'd also like to clear a few things up by denying some of the widely held misbeliefs about what are similes. Firstly, similes are not comparisons that compare two unlike things or things that are category crossing. So this is no doubt the most commonly held misbelief about similes, and this is actually a definition of the term simile from a dictionary. There are many counterexamples. For example, his speech is more effective than sleeping pills, or you can say his speech is just like sleeping pills. There is nothing there need to be understood figuratively, because both his speech and sleeping pills make me want to sleep. So then his speech is actually like sleeping pills in that respect. So nothing there need to be understood figuratively. The comparison is a perfectly category crossing comparison. However, it doesn't make it to be a figurative comparison. So by simply treating simile as category crossing comparison, we forget about the most crucial thing, which is for simile to be simile, they need to be intended figuratively or metaphorically. Then the next point I want to make is similes are not the comparison version of metaphors. So usually people think by converting a metaphor into its comparison form, you will always get a simile, but this is not true. So for example, my grandpa is a child, which is no doubt a typical metaphor. But when you convert it into the comparison form, you get my grandpa is like a child, which is actually a literal comparison. Because the speaker is here trying to say, well, my grandpa is like a child in being full of creative ideas and energetic and maybe sometimes even very fragile. So all of those associated typical qualities with children there's no problem to apply them to describe my grandpa, making this a perfectly literal comparison. So what does it mean? It means that some of the studies that reported the difference between metaphor and simile, well, in terms of their processing and interpretation, they might just report the difference between metaphor and literal comparisons. If they treat category crossing comparison or the comparison version of metaphor as simile, because some of them, as we see here, they are not proper similes actually. So whether a comparison is literal or not, or whether it is figurative or not, depends only on if its intended interpretation is a literal one or not, or if its intended interpretation is a figurative one or not. And then now I think we will look at the most interesting question that we want to learn, which is how are similes understood? Well, although simile itself is seldomly studied, but thanks to the popularity of metaphor and for people who view metaphor as essentially implicit similes, we are able to see some accounts that have been proposed for explain the interpretation of comparison statement. So these accounts are labeled as the comparison account. Well, since similes are a type of comparison statement, then most theories they suggest that similes are understood by conducting a comparison process and finding the shared properties between the topic and vehicle. And the process of arriving at the shared property can be one of feature matching. So as the name suggests, in order to understand a comparison, basically you'll need to explore the feature sets associated with the two concepts, and then trying to find what is in common between the two feature sets, what is the overlapping properties. So for example, Dio is like a vowel, then we're just finding what is in common between the two feature sets associated with the two concepts, which are transparent, converging, and shimmering. Well, another alternative to arrive at common properties is by making analogy. So, well, it is not necessarily, so the matches, what we are going to find, they are established not between independent features or independent properties, but between the partially isomorphic conceptual structures of the topic and vehicle. And that means the common properties that we are going to find, they do not need to be necessarily independent features. It can also be an abstract relational property. For example, Socrates is like a midwife. Then what is in common between Socrates and midwife might just be a relational property, because both of them, they help someone to produce something within them. So this is a very abstract relational property, but it has a more concrete or narrower manifestation in both of the two domains. So in which for Socrates, he tends to help students produce their own ideas. But for midwife, they help mothers to give birth to their own children. So, but they tend to share the common relational structure, which is help someone to produce something within them. So the two comparison accounts, although they have some differences, so they one is we trying to find the common features, another is trying to find the common relational property, but they do share the same fundamental proposal, which is to understand a comparison statement, you need to carry out a comparing process between two concepts, and then finding what is in common between the two concepts. But one of the very serious challenge is perhaps finding a shared and not trivial property isn't that simple, and sometimes it is not even possible. And this is mainly a challenge for the feature matching account, because the theory has oversimplified the process of arriving at a common property. And usually, in most of the cases, the match can only be found at a higher level, not at the basic level. So, and this phenomenon is called attribute inequality, according to Ottoni, who firstly noticed this issue. So for example, when we try to understand the comparison, my lower is like a shark, then the intended, well, the relevant common properties can include, so both my lower and shark, they are predatory, they are aggressive, vicious, and dangerous. Although we're using the same general term to describe my lower and shark, but the exact sense, the specific meaning of aggressive, vicious, and dangerous when it applies to my lower and the shark are completely different. So the shark is a predator, but my lower is a predator only in the metaphorical sense. So the match is only can only be found at a higher level, not at the basic level. And perhaps the real challenge for all comparison accounts is apparently for some comparison, they are not understood by a comparison process. And these comparisons, they are used to inform, they're used to give new information about the topic. So for example, his life is like a skiff with no oar, or an informative little comparison. He walks to the stage like a rock star. So because for comparison, for carrying out the comparison process, certainly you need to have some knowledge about both the topic and the vehicle in order to carry out a fruitful comparison process between the two things, and then finding what is in common between them. But obviously, with these two cases, we don't need to conduct a comparing process, and also we're unable to conduct a comparing process because we have no idea about who the person is and or any detail about his life. So it seems, so the relevant properties attributed to the topic in those cases, they are not part of the hero's knowledge representation of the topic before. And it seems that the term like, in those cases, it does not necessarily evoke a processing of comparing, but it is instead used as a tool for transferring knowledge from something old, something that we are familiar with, to something new and unfamiliar. So it is not always the case that when like appears, we have to understand a comparison sentence by carrying out a comparison process. And the second question is somehow related with the content I just said. Do we still need to care about similarity when it comes to alternative interpretation? Because for those informative similes and little comparisons, certainly we do not aware of the similarity before deriving a successful interpretation. And I'd like to borrow Max Black's remark on metaphor comprehension to illustrate further about this point. he said it would be more illuminating to say that the metaphor creates the similarity than to say that it formulates some similarity antecedentally existing. So it implies that metaphor creates similarity. So the successful understanding of a metaphor helps us to recognize a similarity between the topic and vehicle instead of the other way around. So I think the same idea applies to informative comparison statement as well, where the meaning of those comparison is not equal to the common properties or the similarity between the two things, but actually the successful interpretation of them creates our recognition of their similarity. And then there seems to be at least two different psychological processes. One is by conducting the comparing process for comparisons, that we already know about both of the topic and vehicle. And for informative similes and literal comparison, their interpretation seems to require something different. And I think this is more which is something that is like a simple property attribution process. And I'll tell you more about it later. And the final question is, so the final challenge to the comparison accounts are why only certain common properties are selected, not the other? Well, given that two things, they can be alike in multiple ways. So both dual and vowel, they are inanimate and they are both silent. Why don't we choose those common properties? So I think we certainly need to include the consideration of contextual relevance to guide the searching process of the common properties. Then this question is actually always the most central one that needs to be addressed in metaphor and simile interpretation. So I'll now try to propose a more contextually sensitive account of how do we understand informative comparison statement. Let's start from a simile.
Sorry, are you aware of the fact that it's actually time to wrap up, sort of? So.
Oh, right. Sorry. Okay, I'll go very quickly about this. Thank you. So for understanding simile, basically, so I'm about to end, but I think this is an important point to talk about. So this simile says his music is like a breath of fresh air. Then the topic actually sets a local context for understanding this comparison. So under this context, certain properties associated with fresh air will get more activated. And those properties will be eventually projected to describe the topic. And then some of the properties that are highly activated and accessible of fresh air, they can include fresh and feeling better than and different from the indoor air. So after we have this idea, so these properties of fresh air, when we try to apply them to describe his music, we'll soon encounter a problem. That is the property of fresh here. It cannot be literally applied to describe his music. And then one thing that we can do is to construct an ad hoc concept, which is fresh star. So the fresh star is derived from the original literal concept of fresh, based on some associations, some relevant associations with fresh. And then the fresh star now can be literally applied to describe his music. And the integration of fresh star and the music will give rise to some emergent properties like novel, creative, or revolutionary. So basically, because fresh star itself, the meaning is very abstract, then what the addressee might do is trying to find relevant properties that can really answer the question that if his music is fresh star, then what likely his music is going to be like. Okay, so for the process of literal comparison, basically, as I said before, the relevant properties associated with the vehicle, they are literally applicable to describe the topic. So nothing, no conceptual modulation of the property we're going to need. And then the take-home message for my talk is, so simile and literal comparison, they share the basic processing mechanism of property attribution. But the comprehension of simile typically involves an additional step of radical conceptual modulation of the relevant but inapplicable vehicle properties, for example, the fresh. And simile interpretation, well, therefore, is more cognitively demanding than that of literal comparison, because the literal interpretation is easier and more accessible to construct than the figurative interpretation. So I did a study before where I asked people to say whether a target sentence makes sense or not. So we have figurative comparison and also literal comparison, and people tend to respond much quicker and also more accurately when the target sentence is a literal comparison. For example, some advertisements are like good movies. Then when the target sentence is a simile, and some countries are like good movies. Okay, and I think, oh, actually there is another slide, but since the time is up, I'll leave it later. If you're ever interested, I'll just handle relevant issues in a question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for one quick question, like
right.
3 minutes altogether.
Sorry.
Is there a question from the audience? Yes, Deirdre. Could you please unmute yourself?
You see, I never learn. Thank you for your presentation. My question is really about whether your intuition about the difference between metaphor and simile is that in simile, you cannot go straight to a literal predicate, a literal property. You have to go via another metaphor. Is that right? Because whereas in a metaphor you have to, and in a figurative simile you have to. Is that right?
Yes. So for simile, my definition is kind of like stricter than the traditional description, because for me, I think for comparison to be a simile, it has to be intended metaphorically and figuratively. So it has to be understood metaphorically. Then that require the interpretation process. Well, yes, you cannot just define something that can be literally applied to the topic. Then you need to do something else to modulate the concept in order for it to be literally applicable to describe the topic.
When you take John is like a cactus, and the property you go straight to is if you come close to him, you're in danger of being hurt. That's
yes,
an absolutely literal.
I know. So I think for simile, it doesn't have to be every relevant property need to have this conceptual modulation. At least some of the property, some of the important property has to undergo this modulation. I think that will make the comparison to be a simile. So it doesn't need that every one of the relevant property need to go through the process.
Obviously not, because metaphors always end up with a literal attribute. And so the worry is, why can't you, in either metaphor or figurative simile, go straight from cactus to being hurt? I'm just worried that you've got an intuition that isn't quite being explained by your idea that, well, you probably first have to go through another metaphor.
Yes, that is, I think metaphor is figurative because the form, we have this categorical form, and which that so it cannot be understood literally. But for simile and comparison statement, you have this comparison form, and that means you can always understood it in a literal way. So that is why I feel it's essential to have this kind of distinction between simile and comparison by saying that for simile, you need to have this actual property conceptual modulation step in order for it to be considered separately from other literal comparison. And then, yeah, so.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. There is no time for more questions, so I would like to invite our next speaker.